In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. It's a pleasure to be with you here yet again, week after week, exploring different topics and a number of different issues pertaining to one's worldview. And today's topic is Calvinism. What is the TULIP? Calvinism is something that we've spoken on the show before. We've had a couple, we've had an Arminian come on the show. We've had the traditional Southern Baptist position sort of explained, but we haven't had a Calvinist come on to talk about Calvinism, and so we're going to be talking about that today. But before we get to the main topic of the show, I've just got, I think, one main announcement. So Defenders Media has signed up with Mustard Seed, and Mustard Seed is it's something that I only found out through social media, actually. I saw a Facebook ad and looked into it. And Chris, I know you... I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of people saving their spare change and then donating that spare change to a ministry that, they might be interested in. I don't know if your church does that.
Yeah, I do that from time to time.
Okay. Yeah, and our church does something for CareNet. So what about your digital spare change, though? Because everyone's using cards now.
Oh.
Yes. So here, this is, ahead of the curve. Basically, Mustard Seed is an organization that will connect to your bank account and round up your charges on your card, your debit or your credit card. So, like, let's say your cup of coffee is, $2.50.
Sure.
They will then round it up to 50 and take that 50 cents and put it in a fund toward a ministry of your choice. So Defenders Media has now set up with Mustard Seed. So if you want to donate your spare change to Defenders Media, all you do is go to mustardseedapp.org/defenders. That's mustardseedapp.org/defenders, and you can sign up to have your spare change come to our ministry. And for those of you who might be wondering, how much money does that roughly turn out to be? I think Mustard Seed said something like, on average, it's about $20, $22 maybe a month. And it would just be a great way for you to support our ministry work that we do, not just here on the podcast, but the support network that is Defenders. Would love to get your support. And again, that URL is mustardseedapp.org/defenders. And I'll put up a link on the Veracity Hill website, and we'll get that up at the Defenders website as well. Okay, now before we jump into the main thrust of the program today, if you want to join us in on that discussion, there's a number of ways you can get in touch with us. You can give us a call. The number is 505-2STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. And you can also text the word Veracity. That's VERACITY to the number 555-888. And so I will I forgot to sign into that program, but I will do that right now. So if you want to text with me, you can do so. All right, good. Well, without further ado, let me get this program going here. So, our guest today, this was something that a couple of people had brought up. They'd wondered when would we bring a Calvinist on to talk about Calvinism. It's a topic I feel like I kind of know like the back of my hand. So it was a bit, I never felt like it was a weak point, should I say, on this. So if people ever had questions about it, I think I could, do it very well. Nevertheless, so we would like to invite now Nate Taylor, who is the pastor of Hidden Valley Presbyterian Church in Utah, onto the show. Nate, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Kurt. It's a blessing to be on here and to have a friendly and fun discussion with you.
Yes, yeah. So for those of you wondering, Nate has a bachelor's in theology from Biola University. He's got an MDiv from Westminster Seminary in California, and an MA in philosophy of religion from Talbot School of Theology. And for those of you wondering if maybe we've got some connection. I'm still trying to figure that out myself, Nate, because, I went to Biola, let's see, when what was that? I was there from '06 to 2011. So I don't know if you were there at that time. When were you at Biola or Talbot?
Well, I did a lot of my courses in a junior college to save money, but I was there the time you were there, and we actually had mutual friends. So I had heard of you before I even talked to you, even on Facebook and everything. We've had fun interactions and that sort of thing about God's sovereignty and
Sure.
Freedom and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually knew about you for about 3 years before even meeting you. So I get you've kind of amassed quite a reputation for yourself, I guess I would say.
I guess so. So were you, so let's see, you did your online stuff. So when did you do your undergrad, though? Because that probably wasn't mostly online back then.
No, it wasn't. I did it, I think, memory serves, and it usually doesn't. 08 to 010, so I was there for 2 years.
Okay.
Got in and out, and
so we did have some overlap then.
Out because we did. I don't know if I ever saw you on campus because I didn't know about you then, but
sure.
we did have mutual friends I went to Westminster with, and of course Talbot as well.
Right.
To get my MA in philosophy there, we had mutual friends as well.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's right. And then I know we've met online and had numerous discussions, and I know you're a sharp guy, so I'm glad, especially so someone like yourself who has studied philosophy. That's something. So philosophy was my undergrad, and I very much appreciate it when people who have studied theology have also studied philosophy and recognize the importance of thinking well and thinking critically in theological areas. So I'm very glad that you've agreed to come on the show. So let's get rolling here since there are 5 points. And I take it, now let me ask you, are you a 5-pointer or a 4-pointer?
Well, if there were 7 points, I would affirm all of them.
Good. All right.
I guess I'm kind of I guess you'd say, a classically reformed Calvinist.
Right.
Meaning I not only hold to the 5 points of Calvinism, but I hold to...
You ascribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith and...
Yeah, but I would also hold to, God determines, all events. He's foreordained, I guess, is a theological term, but in philosophy, he's determined all events, and that he is the causal source of human activity, as well as, impersonal events and so on. So I would say, I'm a determinist, I'm a compatibilist, and like I said, if there were 7 points, I'd be a 7-point Calvinist, but alas, there's only 5, so
Sure.
I'm a 5-point Calvinist.
And so for those wondering what is a 7-point Calvinist, Nate, feel free to correct me here, but at least the way I talk about 7-point Calvinism is I incorporate 2 letters, the O and the S. So I would say it's O tulips. The O referring to original sin, and the Reformed positions on that. And there are some slight differences on the O. For example, if you're an Augustinian versus a federal headship type of guy. So the difference is there. The S is the strong upplay on the sovereignty of God. Sort of as you had just mentioned, that God's sovereignty entails sort of determinism. That can be sort of strung in a couple different ways as well. But
Right. Well, I would actually say I hold the tulips. The O is embedded in the T in the traditional confessions of the Reformed faith. So
Gotcha.
The canons of Dort, for instance, and their condemnations and so on, they would embedded in there would be original sin, the corruption, and original guilt, the imputation or the transfer of Adam's sinful act in the Garden of Eden. So I would be just a tulip. So I guess that would be to use your terminology.
Okay, good. Well, this is a good starting point then. So the TULIP, as many of you know, is an English acronym. It wasn't there when John Calvin lived, and in fact, the systemization of the points was a response to Jacob Arminius historically. But now, of course, it's just popularly known as the TULIP, and this is where the term. I mean, Calvinism is a bit broader than the TULIP because of the various positions on divine providence or foreknowledge and different views of election. So it's broader than that. But essentially, Calvinism is roughly synonymous with the TULIP. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, well, some people get uptight, right? So, some people would say, but I would say you're right, just for purposes of our contemporary discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I've heard it in our contemporary discussion is that if you're Reformed, you hold to at least one Reformed confession, whether it be the Westminster, the Heidelberg Catechism. But in our linguistic framework and how we speak just today, people who are Calvinists can be Baptist, Pentecostal,
right,
in terms of holding to the TULIP, right?
Yeah, right.
And so I guess you might want to say it might be near Calvinism, right? The TULIP.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the Calvinist system obviously originates from Calvin and Beza and those thinkers and the Reformed scholastics, and that's a whole system of thought. And it's my belief and my contention that if you take out one of those aspects of Reformed thought, then it ends up being an inconsistent system of thought. But that's another discussion for another time, as I'm sure you know. So
sure, yeah,
yeah. But roughly, I would say yes.
Yeah, and there are, of course, some fierce debates over the L being the big one there on whether
right,
the 4-pointer or the 5-pointer. But I'm glad that we've got a 5-pointer here, because now no one can tell me that we haven't had a 5-pointer represented yet on the show. Okay, so we've got the T, and the T stands for total depravity. And so
right
now there are some Calvinists, in my experience, who when I read Calvin, I come across a number of passages that suggest, well, not only Calvin, but some other authors like Edwin Palmer, who suggest here that depravity refers to man, unregenerate humans, only doing what is evil. And even if there is some appearance to goodness, that goodness is only a relative good, and it's not an objective good. So I know some Calvinists would push against that, and so I'd like to get your take on that.
Well, I would make a distinction between civic good or public good and spiritual good standing before a holy and righteous God. Romans 8 says those who are in the flesh cannot please God. And Romans 3 talks about no one being good, not even one. No one seeks after God. Jeremiah talks about the leopard and not being able to change a spot, so are those who do evil. And so they have this complete inability, apart from the regeneration of the Holy Spirit, to perform any spiritually good action. That's not to say that that they can't perform good actions like helping an old lady across the street, being nice to your neighbors, having friendly discussion, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But as Romans 1 says, they know that God exists, and they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So they know God, and they self-deceive themselves, I would say. Mm-hmm. And so if someone does an action, take any action, helping an old lady, if it's not done in reference to the greatest possible good, which is God, God's the greatest possible being, sure, and so He's the greatest possible good. If you do an action in the face of and without any regard and indeed hatred towards the greatest good, it's impossible for that action to be good. I would say. I think that's pretty intuitive to me, that if it's the greatest good and an action you perform is completely without regard and indeed in defiance against the greatest good, which is God, so then I would say this action's obviously evil. Yeah. Okay, so let me take another example here. So you've got a mother who feeds her children. Is that a truly objective good action, or is that? Yeah. Go ahead. Well, yeah. So I would say that a mother feeding her children does biological good. It's civic good, helps a family and helps society. Raising well-ordered children and protecting them is a civic good. I would say that it's not as evil as, say, Hitler exterminating 6 million Jews, right? So the confession says, and I believe Scripture teaches, that obviously there are degrees of wickedness one can perform, and that would be a very, very small degree of wickedness. And the reason why it would be wicked at all is because, again, every action is done
because it's
in
not
defiance and against the greatest good.
Right.
And how can an action be good if it's against the greatest good? That seems kind of inconsistent. And
so even though
virtue of that, then I would say,
Sorry, yeah. So even though it's a civic good, it's a biological good, it's still ultimately a small spiritual wicked action. Is that fair? Okay, cool.
That's right.
And I know
that's correct. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, good. I mean, that's the way I've understood it, given my reading of Calvin and of Edwin Palmer's book. What's his book? The 5 Points of Calvinism, I think it's called. So great. So I'm glad to see that at least personally, I don't misunderstand the T. And in fact, I think I've come across Calvinists who have misunderstood the T even. So
me too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. There's people that misunderstand their own positions across the board, across the spectrum. Yeah. So I don't necessarily.
Yep.
That's not a point against Calvinists by any means. Okay. So now you mentioned a number of Bible passages, and longtime listeners of the show will know that, oftentimes when you're dealing with a controversy, there's different ways to understand the passages and in Scripture. And sometimes it just it boils down to interpretation. How does one interpret something? So one passage you mentioned, which is a big one on the T, is Romans 3. There are none who do good, none that seek God. Do you think that? I mean, Paul's quoting from there, and how do you interpret him? I mean, do you see? I take him to be making a number. He's taking a number of passages from the Old Testament and then formulating an argument from that. And of course, the way I understand his argument's different. So you take him here to sort of be. Is he giving new meaning to these passages when he uses them? I'm trying to ask that in a fair way, because at least the way Calvin Calvin actually wrote that he treats Paul as if Paul is using these words for the first time, and sometimes we do see New Testament authors giving a new meaning to Old Testament phrases. Don't muzzle an ox. Paul gives a new meaning to that elsewhere. So what's your take on that?
Right. Well, so two things, and I've read your take on this just online and your interaction with Aaron Brake and J. Warner Wallace on these issues. So I read the interaction on that. And so my understanding of this text is that this text is not even very much of a difficulty, given in Acts chapter 15, you have them reinterpreting or what seems to be reinterpreting or adding new meaning to prophecy of Amos about rebuilding the tent and everything and being applied to the Gentiles. So I have no problem with the New Testament authors interpreting the Old. But I think in this case, it's in my view, a pretty easy way of handling this. I would take it to be about a condemnation on humanity being wicked, and that these are taken from a number of Psalms and so on, in which specific wicked men are mentioned, right? And so in this case, I think Paul is saying that in taking the Psalm and saying these wicked men are not just, an accident, but this is a representation of wickedness in all humanity, indeed. And it's kind of like the Sufjan Stevens song with John Wayne Gacy, when he talks about this heinous murderer. He says, underneath the floorboards, we're all really just like him. Look under the floorboards to see what I have hid. And so he's saying, in a sense, the wickedness of John Wayne Gacy is present in all of our hearts. We think, I think, many times continually sinful thoughts. Even the regenerate do at times, and I think the confession teaches that, and so on and so forth. I think common sense teaches that. So I think that what Romans 3, to be more direct, is just taking these as representative samples of the wickedness inside of all unregenerate human beings.
Yeah. Well, and certainly I think, in Romans 2 and in the 3, Paul says, and this is a point against Christians. He says, we do the same things, and so I think that's a very interesting point on that. All right, well, I'd love to keep going on this, and of course there's other passages we could look at and talk about, but for the sake of getting in all of the 5 points, let's move along to the U, unconditional election. Tell me, what's that about?
Yes, this is probably the most offensive one, if you want my honest opinion. Maybe this and the I are the most offensive ones. But I think they're going to be defended by philosophy and reason, of course, as I think all the Bible can.
Yeah.
But I would say that this one is unconditional election. So there is no condition in you, no intrinsic feature of you, nothing about you that made God choose you. The reason for choosing you is extrinsic in the divine will and nature. So it's God who has a basis for picking you, not anything in you, but purely on God's desires and greater good. So it's not arbitrary. That's a misunderstanding. It's not like this sort of voluntarist, sort of willing, picking and choosing. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. This one saved and this one damn kind of thing. I wouldn't want to say that.
I got to say, in all of my times,
that
in all of my years discussing Calvinism, I have yet to have the Calvinists refer to the eeny, meeny, miny, mo method.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, sometimes I can be a character. I'm sorry.
But you're right. But on Calvinism, it's not an arbitrary thing. There are reasons, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but someone like yourself would say, but we don't necessarily know what those reasons are. We aren't in an epistemic place to know why. I mean, perhaps it is because it maximizes God's glory or something like that, but ultimately we can't know. Is that fair?
I think so. I think depending on how you want to go and interpret scriptures, you can, I think for that, you probably want to stick with the defense, but you can also give a theodicy for that kind of thing, right, which is an actual reason defense based on actual scripture text. People have attempted to do that, and indeed in Calvinism on the problem of evil, you have people get something close to that. I would say it's for God's glory. I would be okay with saying that, but you might ask the further question, well, then how does it contribute to God's glory? And then you would kind of have the skeptical theist response perhaps at that point, or perhaps for reasons.
Yeah.
Depending on that, you might say, well, God has a reason, and maybe you don't know about it, So I think that's very fair, Kurt. But, what I wanted to mention about this point is that obviously, just to contrast it with the Arminian position, is it's not based on foreseen, or if you're Boethian, or seeing faith. Mm-hmm. And so it's not based on what you will or would do in the future. It's based on God's decision whether or not one will be going to glory or to hell, basically. And that's basically how I would say it. I also would say I would say that God saves everybody when God saves them is in a state of condemnation, but God saves those out of that state of condemnation is the way I would put it. More, I guess, less extreme view, I guess. Is what I'm trying to say.
All right, so we've got a couple questions here from our Facebook live stream. Thank you to those that are tuning in here on Facebook. And so it's related to the U here. And so Kyle asks this question. He says, I teach Christian worldview to high school students. Given the sovereignty of God and the concept of election, is it intellectually honest to tell a student it is their free choice that condemns people to hell for eternity?
Yes, I'm a compatibilist, so I think that's very intellectually honest. Indeed, I would say that's what I say, so I hope it's intellectually honest. Yes, so I believe in free will. Geez, who could deny such a thing? It seems sort of obvious to me that we have free will.
Sure.
So I of course, hold to that, which is, I hold to compatibilism, which is that free will is compatible with predestination. People might think, well, that's you got to be a nut to believe that. Well, actually, about 60% of philosophers hold that position. Indeed, most of them, and many of them, work in action theory. So I'm not a nut for saying that. Just I know people who listen to a lot of Craig and stuff, and a lot of Christian apologists may be shocked by that, but those are the numbers. I think might be the mid 2005, 2006.
Sure.
I could be wrong about that. My memory's not the best sometimes.
I don't know how carefully Kyle intended to craft his question, but here he does ask, whether it's their free choice that condemns, well, it says people to hell. Just maybe he means them to hell. So just exploring this point a bit further, so what about unborn babies, for example? What would be your view there, where they haven't made a free choice,
Yes.
but given inherited guilt, what do you think their eternal state would be?
I think the Scripture and plain reason teach that unborn babies, all of them, without exception, those who are mentally handicapped and don't have the cognitive faculties and so on, all go to heaven, which actually is very high, because most births end 75%. So if you hold my view, 75% of people end up going to heaven. Right there. So I would base it on Deuteronomy 1, the children going into the land, which is a type of heaven according to Hebrews. What children going to the land on the basis of the fact they neither knew evil or good. And that's the basis for them entering the promised land. And of course, you have the classic text in 2 Samuel, where you have David say he's going to see his son again, basically in heaven. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what it says. That's how I would take that passage. So, you have these passages, and you have God so loved the world. I don't think it's a few select people. I think it's an overwhelming amount of people that will be in heaven. After all, if God's in control, we would expect that sort of thing, wouldn't we? And, all these all and world phrases, I think, apply to the fact that a vast majority of human beings will be in heaven. And I'm a post-millennialist, so...
Oh, okay.
So
well, that would explain that. Yeah, right, because... know, generally speaking, and by generally, I pretty much just mean in my experience, Calvinists typically aren't so optimistic about that. Would you agree that maybe you're in the minority on that position?
Well, in both Reformed circles and in evangelical circles, obviously you have people like, Ken Gentry, the post-millennialist, and John MacArthur holds infant salvation. So it's out there. And by the way, John MacArthur's book, I think it's In the Hands of God, is just a terrific defense of infant salvation, the biblical basis for it. I find that book very helpful and very useful. But there's numerous passages, I think, that suggest that, basically. So I would say it can be a minority view. I've not counted heads, but I would say it's out there, and I've explained this in Reformed churches, and no one loses their minds. So yeah,
they don't burn you at the stake.
Not yet. So.
Funny. All right, let me take another question here from Ben online. He asks, how can God be said to be loving if God could save every individual from a terrible fate through irresistible grace into a loving relationship with him, but chooses not to?
Oh, I see. We're going irresistible grace. Yeah.
So it's kind of a question to the you. Why doesn't God choose everyone? So this is Amyraldianism, right? So historically,
you could apply it both to irresistible grace and it's kind of both, right? It's the way you're understanding it. I see. Yeah. So I would say that there's a general sense of love that God has for every human person, and Matthew 5 says that we're to love others because we're to emulate our Father in heaven, and that would presuppose that Father in heaven loves everybody. But I would say that he does, but there are greater goods that need to be accomplished so that a fraction, a margin, a small minority of individuals end up in hell for God's inner Trinitarian love for himself. And so love is not just directed towards humanity, but God's multi-personal love towards each other for maximalization of glory and indeed justice and hatred towards evil. Or I could just say that God has a good reason for sending these individuals to hell that we don't know about, and it's such that it's consistent and justifiable with his love towards them.
Okay. All right. Well, Ben, if you've got a further up there, you can. If you've got a follow up, you can write below there in the little live stream. Okay. So let's keep moving along here. Actually, I'm looking at the time though, and we've got to take a break, Nate. So when we come back, we will touch on the rest of the TULIP, the 3. Or, I mean, I guess 4 if you're holding to the 7 point. All right, so stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Are you tired of wasting your time and money on ads that just aren't producing? What if there was an easier way to get great advertising results with tons of traffic and social engagement to your brand without wasting your time or money? Well, there is an easier way, and it's called trafficbuffet.com, a new and easy way to generate the traffic you need through our global network of publishers, all with one click. Explode your site traffic and send tens of thousands of potential customers to your site daily. Build your brand with our social campaigns like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and more. Our dedicated account reps provide amazing support. So don't wait. Get started today. TrafficBuffet.com. Measurable results, driving success.
All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. Well, I am here with Nate Taylor, and we are talking about Calvinism, the 5 points of the TULIP. And during the first half of the show, we were able to make it through 2, the T, and the U. But Nate, let's take a moment now here and talk about the L, especially because this is not only a point of contention among Calvinists, but this is actually where personally I hold to half of a point. And this is the only half of the point that I find myself in agreement with the TULIP. And so this is also one of the reasons why, because at least classical Arminians would affirm the T, would affirm total depravity. And so insofar as I disagree with them and a couple other issues, I don't even call myself an Arminian. I guess that makes me like a hodgepodge, but I don't consider myself a what do they say, the buffet style theologian. So I think
right.
I've got my points, and I think they're coherent and connected. But at any rate, so we've got the L, limited atonement. Explain to us, why is this a point of contention even amongst Calvinists?
Well, just kind of a funny thing is I would call them Amyraldians because it's from Amyro, a French Protestant, and so Amyraldianism is the 4 points. I guess it's a tulip.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how it goes. But yeah, particular redemption, limited atonement. I prefer particular redemption. Or if you're a post-millennialist and believe in infant salvation, it's not so limited, is it? It's very vast atonement. But nonetheless, yeah, it's that Jesus died specifically for his sheep, for the elect, for his bride, as it says in Ephesians 5, that he dies exclusively for his bride, the church. And husbands are to lay down their life for their wife, not any other woman, but for their wife. And so Jesus lays down his life exclusively and only for the elect, for his sheep. That's basically the limited or particular redemption viewpoint. And so obviously it can be offensive to people who said Jesus died for every single individual, Judas and Hitler and so on. People want to say the atonement is for them, and I would say it's not. But yeah, that would be basically the view, and it gets people's feathers ruffled, but I think there's ample biblical support for it, and indeed theological support, given the nature of a substitutionary atonement where Jesus takes hell in your place. He takes hell in the place for everyone. No one's going to hell, but Matthew 25 says that there will be those who go to eternal punishment in hell. So, yeah, that would be basically a quick summary of it.
Sure, yeah. And I want to thank you for the quick summary. So maybe let's flesh out some of the concepts there, though. So is it, in what way could we say that Jesus died for Hitler or, some other evil person that we could think of? Is there a way that we could say that Jesus died for that person?
I would say that he died in so a couple things. You have 2 Peter 1 who says that those who are in the covenant were bought by the Lord, by Christ. It's a reference to Jude. Parallel, they're obviously dependent on each other if you parallel the text. It's reference to Christ buying these individuals, and I would say that's a covenantal buying. So they're part of the external covenant, part of the people of God. Not all Israel is Israel. So Jesus died to bring about a new covenant where you have a mixed community of believers and unbelievers. And so there's unbelievers in the covenant receiving, gospel benefits, help, support from the ministers and so on. That is a part of the new covenant, but they're obviously not saved. And then again, you have the idea of where you have Jesus buying it to where he dies for the sins of people and dies for the purpose of the proclamation of the gospel. If Jesus doesn't die, there's no gospel. And so you could say in that indirect sense that we can get a gospel presentation to everyone because of the death of Christ. So there's definite implications for unbelievers, I would say, for the death of Christ. But there's no salvific and special grace given to unbelievers on the basis of Christ's atonement that is specifically and exclusively for the elect, I would say.
So we might be close here on this. So would you say, so the language of sufficiency, at least this is the way I've explained it. So I think that Christ's atoning work is and will be effective only for the elect. However, it's sufficient for all. So it's sufficient for all would they or if they believed. Would you agree with that, or would you have a point of disagreement there?
Well, so there's two things. That language is in Confessions, and obviously Reformed people affirm that. The question is, what do you mean by sufficient? Sufficient for what and sufficient for whom? What does sufficiency mean there? Well, I take the sufficiency clause in the limited atonement or particular redemption qualification to mean that it's Jesus, Christ, Son of God himself. He could atone for millions and billions and an infinite amount of people. So you don't need two Jesuses dying. You don't need two Son of Gods dying. You only need one. Yeah. That's it. If they were to believe, would they have the atonement? That would be like a totally different counterfactual situation. And so, I can't even make sense of that phrase in light of possible world talks because, and counterfactual talk because if they believed and Jesus only died for them, well, it's sort of impossible because if Jesus dies for anybody and they believe, there's always a connection or a coextension there. If I believe Jesus died for me, I can't envision a situation, I think it's probably impossible, I think it is impossible, that we have someone believing in Christ and, no atonement for you, no soup for you, right, kind of thing. I can't even.
A Seinfeld reference.
That's right. Right. I would say that's logically impossible, actually.
Okay. All right.
That sort of talk. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Sorry. So maybe I'm glad I asked that because I was thinking maybe we were a bit closer, but no, it's good to see there that you're holding to the traditional view on that. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So thanks for explaining that. And then let's go over to the I, which is, as you had said, maybe the second most, either the first or second most. You didn't use the word repulsive, provocative, or controversial.
Yeah, I'm okay with you being politically incorrect and saying offensive. There's no problem with that.
I mean, it does offend some people. Yeah. I mean. So irresistible,
and that's simply what I mean by offensive too. I don't mean it's offensive to me, although if you're struggling with it, I don't want to be insensitive to that. Irresistible grace is the view that when God saves you, He doesn't fail. When He elects to save you, that process will be brought to completion, and so. He will, if He draws you, His drawing will be successful. I would say since God's the greatest possible being, He'll have every characteristic or attribute that's better to have rather than to lack, and it's better to be successful in your endeavors rather than unsuccessful. And so He'll have that property of being successful in all of His plans and intentions and accomplishing them. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that He accomplishes redemption in the elect by drawing them through being born again. 1 John 5:1 says that if you believe, you've already been born again, and so He causes you to be born again, and you have exert free free faith in his Son, Jesus Christ, and you are redeemed. Now, I would say that, this is taught in the Bible, John 6:44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sends me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. And then John, commenting on that in a little bit down in John 6, says that you're not going to come to him unless it's granted by the Father. And Romans 9 says, for why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? Or who are you, O man, to answer back to God? And so no one can resist God's will. No one can cause God to fail in his plans. And if he calls you and redeems you and he causes you to be born again, he will not fail in that process. And so his grace is irresistible. And so, a pickup line for girls is, well, honey, you're like grace, you're irresistible. So it's a Calvinist pickup line there. So it also works for you to be incredibly charming if you're a single reform male, which I understand some reform males desperately need. I'm just kidding, that's a joke.
Oh, that's hilarious. Okay. So irresistible grace. So basically, when God regenerates the will of someone whom he has elected, they to use sort of at least some philosophical jargon, would you say they don't have the ability to choose otherwise?
I deny PAP, and I think most consistent Calvinists deny PAP.
Yeah.
The
explain
principle of alternative possibility. I'm sorry, that you can do otherwise. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So for those that want, PAP is the principle of what was it again?
Alternative possibility.
Alternative possibilities.
Alternative
yes.
Possibility. Yeah.
Okay, great. So for you would say that that people don't have another option. That we're just doing. We want to do it because at that point God has regenerated our wills.
Right.
So it's just something. It's not necessarily a choice, right? I mean, it's not a libertarian free choice. I'm getting into the jargon here, and I'm trying not to.
Sure. Well, actually, I don't know about that, because there are people like Dave Hunt and others that hold to the sourcehood condition, meaning that they're the principle of alternative possibility, having two pathways to go down, is not necessary for free will, but they're libertarian.
Okay.
And you have a similar thing if you hold the foreknowledge. This is why these guys hold it. It's fallible foreknowledge. God believes you're going to perform an action 10,000 years later, 10,000 years before you perform an action. He believes you're going to say, eat the red apple, and it happens 2,000 years later. You can't render a belief God has as false, and so that belief entails that future decision. You couldn't do any differently than what God believes you're going to do. You can't make God's decisions false. And so, if you hold to an A theory of time, and that sort of thing, then this is a real issue for those libertarians, those Arminians. So I would say I'm in the position of most Arminians, and also, but not in the position of open theists who obviously hold the PAP, I think, in the consistent way possible, because of course God doesn't know the future infallibly. So that's kind of what I would take from all that. I would say, yeah, PAP is something you can deny. And indeed, if you hold to the B theory of time, the Boethian view that God, past, present, and future exist, I can make determinism compatible with PAP. So it's not. I think the PAP discussion is not even connected to this. I think logically you can separate it out in my mind.
Okay, so
as many have done.
Yeah, I know that there's a huge philosophical debate on this. But let's bring it back a little bit here. What might be some biblical passages that support the I of the tulip?
Yeah, I'd say John 6:44 is a big one. That's a big enchilada. You have 2 Corinthians chapter 4, which talks about being in bondage, and that God creates in you new life as He created from the world. Sort of this causal sufficiency being stressed there. You have an implication from Romans chapter 9.
Yep.
God's will is irresistible. Why does He still find fault? For who can resist His will?
And
then you have 1 John 5. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so in Romans 9, I mean, that's a big one on election, on unconditional election,
right,
and also the eye. You've got the potter and the clay analogy.
Right.
So if I may sort of run with that. So
sure.
In Jeremiah 18, Jeremiah 18 is where I think Paul's taking the potter and the clay analogy. So what's your take there? Because in Jeremiah 18, it's very much about corporate language. I've got it up here. Let me just read a couple verses. Sure. Then the word of the Lord came to me. He said, "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does, declares the Lord? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so you are in my hand, Israel. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned." And then it continues on and on. So how did you understand Jeremiah 18 and the potter and the clay, and then maybe even how Paul's using it?
Right. So, this kind of goes back to the Reformed tradition and how we interpret texts, and we follow the Apostles' example of this, of having the New Testament interpret the Old Testament rather than the Old Testament interpreting the New Testament. So, I mean, like in the case of Acts 16 and the tent being rebuilt and so on, and being applied to Gentiles coming into the kingdom. So you have the New Testament text guide and control that, rather than having the Old Testament interpret the New Testament.
Gotcha.
That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that if you look at the New Testament text itself, say it's abundantly evident that it's not talking about nations. Or I shouldn't say abundantly evident. I would just say it's far more reasonable than not, I guess. It's not.
Yeah, right. That's all you would need for your case. But, yeah.
Right. Sure. Yeah, that sort of threshold there. So, you have, for instance, calling and mercy and works used. And throughout the book of Romans, that kind of language is used of specific individual salvation. So we're working within a context here where Paul applies these words consistently to specific individuals. That's one thing. That's the second thing, I should say. The third thing is that the objections generated in Romans 9 seem to be exactly what you want to say to a Calvinist in these discussions. And indeed, I get them all the time. Well, if God's in control, why does he hold people responsible? Why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? And those are sort of, Paul, Paul's teaching Calvinism because he anticipates all the Calvinist objections. Is there injustice on God's part? And he talks about he hardens whomever he wills, and he has mercy on whomever he wills, and it's not based and dependent on man's will, but dependent on God. And so these are all the things Calvinists say, and then they generate Calvinist responses. And then lastly, I'd add that there's always specific individuals referenced, Pharaoh and Jacob and Esau. And so those are the reasons why I prefer the individual specific form of salvation that's taught in the traditional Reformed take of Romans 9.
Yeah. It's on one of those subpoints, I agree with you. So the passages in Romans 9 seem to suggest responses to the objections against Calvinism. They certainly can be used that way. Of course, I've got a different take on Romans 9, and I think Paul's anticipating objections refer to some other objection. But you're certainly right that the passages do. For me, I would say they seem to suggest that. And that's why there is the controversy, the debate. What is the objection Paul is responding to? And that's sort of the difficulty with biblical criticism. We're trying to figure out that other side of the conversation. We don't have the letter from the Church of Rome to Paul. Right.
Yeah, and the idea I would have is that we look at a less controversial text where we're more readily able to grant things. So when it says, "Or we just sin all we want, that grace may abound," we know that Paul just preached the gospel of justification by faith alone and grace alone, by Christ alone. And so when you preach that, people will say, "Well, that's true. You can just sin all you want," and no one has any difficulty granting that. But I think with the more heated text, I think people have different ideas, and that's why you have this happening over the controversial text.
Yep. Before we leave the eye, we do have a question here online. This is from Kevin. He writes, "Certainly Calvinism is deeply entrenched in the modern church, but I have yet to hear a good explanation for how Adam and Eve had free will to not choose God, but have the inability to choose God. I mean, even to that, I would say, Nate, maybe correct me if I'm mistaken, even Augustine believed that Adam and Eve did have the ability to choose God, and it was only post-fall that humans inherited a nature of being unable to choose God. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, once you get rid of, first of all, like you have a broader definition of path, right? Like, or principle of alternative possibilities.
Yeah.
I would say it was not contrary to their natures to choose to do the good. That, for instance, it's not incompatible with Adam's current nature. But if you're an unregenerate sinner and you have all of these bad-making properties of depravity and sinfulness, then given that state of nature, it's impossible for you to choose God without God's aid. And in the case of Adam and Eve, I'd say their natures were unblemished. And so, though they did suffer weakness of will, which is itself a mystery in philosophy, weakness of will is a very difficult topic, and of course that's what I think Adam and Eve had. So they had this instance of weakness of will, and obviously God foreknew that, and he determined it. So I would say that in that sense, even in the sense of the classical Arminian would hold to God's foreknowledge determining their free choice in that sense, then yeah, I would say they couldn't do otherwise in that strict kind of tap way that you have the background and you have all the entire history of the world leading up to that one choice being identical. In that sense, then yeah, I mean, I would say they didn't have PAP. But in another sense, I would say that there are possible worlds or other possible scenarios where their nature is such that they did choose the good. Yeah, I would say.
So now, last question before we leave the eye. I promise, last question.
No worries.
So here we've got God instructing Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit. And yet, Calvinism seems to suggest that God has determined them to eat the fruit. So does it seem disingenuous for God to command something that he determined them to do anyway?
Right. Well, yeah, in the case of the Bible, right, I mean, you have that happening even on the Arminian view. You have God determining people and doing things opposite of his revealed will. It's going to happen on any view you have. But, yeah, I mean, the Calvinists and I think Arminians have to hold to this commanding will and determining will, or the prescriptive will, or the descriptive will, or the decreed will. And so in this case, God would command, he would interact with Adam and Eve and command them not to eat the fruit of the tree. And this is sort of like the authorial model or the author model of providence, where God, the author of his plan, he authors it like an author of a book, say Tolkien, for instance, or C.S. Lewis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He authors it, and he writes what's going to happen. But I don't think that Tolkien would approve of Gollum's actions or anything like that. But he did write him to do evil things in there, and indeed would be contrary to Tolkien's desires on some level. He thought that Gollum was a morally repugnant character, right? Or Sauron was an evil guy, right? But he wrote him in the story and wrote him to do it. And so that's kind of how the analogy is with us and God, is that he writes in the story, his plan, and he commands them to. He tells them his revealed will, what he considers to be a good person and a bad person, and they go against that, just like you would in, say, someone authoring a book, for instance.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, we're running low on time. Let's move along to the P, perseverance of the saints. This is something that many Arminians affirm, especially Southern Baptists hold to this idea: the once saved, always saved. Tell us what does the P represent?
Right. Well, so the P, perseverance of the saints. That once you have salvation, you're not going to lose it. As it says in Romans 8, nothing can separate us from the love of Jesus Christ. And John 10 says, nothing can snatch you out of my hand. My Father is greater than all. Nothing can snatch you out of his hand. And so this is, I think, John 6:44, you're drawing, you're raised up on the last day. All those who are drawn are raised. Romans 8, you have those who are predestined or those who are glorified. It's this golden chain of redemption. When God accomplishes something, he finishes it. And that's the basic idea there. Now, there's two conceptions of this. There's the Zane Hodges non-lordship salvation, which says, well, you can have, at a Billy Graham crusade, you can walk down the aisle and say you believe in Jesus, and then, die in your last breath as an atheist prostitute doing crack cocaine.
Yeah.
And denying Jesus in your last breath, and you'll go to heaven because once saved, always saved. That's the St. Hodge's free grace, non-lordship view, as opposed to the Calvinist position, which is the lordship view, which is that when God regenerates you and calls you to himself and you exert saving faith in Jesus, that God will continue that good work, and that includes fruits. The fruits do not contribute to your salvation. They are a result of your salvation, and they function as evidences.
Gotcha.
So that's basically the difference there that people get confused on.
So let's take a hypothetical example here. And in fact, for some of us, maybe this can be very realistic. Suppose we know someone who claims to be a Christian for many, many years, and in fact, they do what we would consider bear the fruit of the Spirit. They show these evidences. Nevertheless, time goes on, say a few years, and they begin to falter, to stray away from the faith, and ultimately become an atheist. And along with, I don't just mean propositionally an atheist, I mean functionally an atheist. Was this person ever saved?
Yeah, so you're asking me that as a question, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, right. I mean, would we still think that they are saved, or were they just not really a Christian in the first place, despite having those evidences for a period of their life?
Right. Well, in a sense, we can't know someone's heart. And I have seen many people fall away from out of the church for being a Christian for 10 years at times. And in every case, you look back and there's always little things. Excuse me. For instance, like there's the fact, some people, I've heard people say this to me. It's ridiculous. I go to church just because I want to pick up on Christian girls, or I go there to get attention, or people have all sorts of ulterior motives to be in a community of people who believe in the gospel and believe in grace and believe in a lifestyle that's honoring to God. People want to be a part of that. And so when people fake it, right, they're hypocrites. They live a secret double life and this kind of thing. When people fake that for other reasons, all that shows me is that people get into Christianity for simple reasons. But there's nothing, that's a fact of life, right? Mm-hmm. And so people have had affairs on their spouses, but they didn't know for 10 years. People are devious, and as Jeremiah says, the heart is desperately wicked.
Yeah.
Who could even understand it? And so with that kind of framework on the fallenness of humanity, it's not surprising at all that there are hypocrites in the church that pretend for a long time, just as people pretend in their marriages or in relationships to love people or to do things and so on and so forth.
So
that's what I'd say.
Yeah, so I would certainly agree with you. There are cases like that. But do you think that would cover all the cases? Do you think that people who say that they're Christian, who even show evidences of the Spirit in their life, are just pretending or are disingenuous?
Well, in Hebrews chapter 6, it says that they will do even acts of the Spirit, and it suggests that in Matthew 7, he says, I never knew you.
Yeah.
In Matthew 7. I never knew you. Even though we did all these wonderful works. Well, that's because they were banking on their works and not Christ's works. And so they had a bit of legalism. They did it for self-righteousness. And indeed, out in Utah, there are plenty of people who are experts at faking religion. So, you know what? To someone who lives out here, you're not surprised one bit from the stories you hear.
Sure.
So it doesn't faze me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I like that last point there. Because, you are right. And Mormons are some of the nicest people. But,
right.
You don't necessarily know what their motives are. And if, they very well likely have selfish motivations. And so,
right.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are running low on time here, Nate, but let me thank you for coming on the show today and for describing and explaining the 5 points of Calvinism. It's always good to have someone from that perspective come to talk about those things. And, I'm also glad to see that my understanding of at least a few of the points has been spot on. Even though some Calvinists that I've spoken to would say I don't understand, it seems that at least I think I have. So,
it seems like you have. Yeah, no, it's been great to be on your Kurt, and I appreciate your friendliness and kindness and bringing a fun discussion, as always. So thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Nate. We'll have to have you on sometime again.
Love it. God bless.
All right, same to you. God bless you. All right. Well, that does it for our show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons, for the partnerships with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, and Ratio Christie. Thank you to the tech team, as always. Chris Isley, thank you so much. I appreciate your helping me out week after week. And so thanks for that. All right, and then also, again, let me say a special thanks to Nate Taylor for coming to talk about Calvinism and the various 5 points of the TULIP, though really it's kind of like 7 points. And if you have any questions about Calvinism or, a number of the Bible passages that Nate mentioned today, like I mentioned in the show earlier, there are alternative ways for interpreting those texts. I'd be happy to answer those questions, so feel free to submit those my way. All right, well, thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.